In the space of 30 years, the world lost almost every throne it had ever built. The Romanovs were shot in a cellar, the Habsburgs, the Hohenzollerns, the Ottomans, 400 years of dynasty each, all of it gone inside a single decade. And then there was Japan, which lost a world war, lost its cities, lost its army and its navy and its empire, and somehow did not lose its emperor. That is the part nobody can quite explain. Because if you were placing bets in 1945 on which monarchy was finished, Japan would have been the easy money. Germany's Kaiser fled over a border and lived out his life pruning roses in a Dutch village. Austria's last emperor died broke on an island off Africa, 34 years old, coughing his lungs out in a rented house. Russia's imperial family was taken down into a basement in Yekaterinburg and never came back up. The Ottoman Sultan walked out of Istanbul in the rain and boarded a British warship, and the 600-year House of Osman ended on a gangplank. Japan's emperor did something none of them managed. He stayed, and he didn't just survive. His family is still there. Right now, today, sitting on a throne that is older than every other monarchy on earth by a margin that isn't even close. The British monarchy traces itself back about 1,000 years. Japan's imperial line, by the historical record, runs at least 1,500, and by its own traditions, considerably longer than that. So how? How does the monarchy that should have been destroyed become the only one that wasn't? The answer is going to surprise you because it has almost nothing to do with strength. In fact, it's close to the opposite. The Japanese Imperial House survived by being, for most of its history, the least powerful monarchy in the world. And I want to walk you through exactly how that worked, because once you see the mechanism, you'll understand why every other dynasty was doomed and this one wasn't. But before we get there, I need you to understand what it actually took, because there's a photograph taken in September of 1945 that decided whether this throne lived or died. And there was a price paid for it, a price that Japan is still arguing about right now, in the last few months, in ways most people outside the country haven't noticed at all. We'll get to both. Start at the beginning. Every monarchy in Europe was built on the same basic deal. The king rules. The king commands the army, appoints the ministers, signs the laws, collects the taxes. Power and legitimacy sat in the same pair of hands. It looked unshakable. It was, in fact, the fatal design flaw, because if the king holds the power, then when people want the power, they have to remove the king. There's no other way to get it. Revolution isn't optional in that system. It's the only available exit. The Russian people didn't hate Nicholas II as a man. Plenty of them had wept at his coronation. They needed what he was sitting on, and the only way to get it was to take him off it, permanently. Japan built something completely different, and it happened almost by accident. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the emperor in Kyoto had already begun sliding out of practical government. The Fujiwara family worked out that you didn't need to be emperor to run the country. You only needed to marry your daughters into the imperial house and govern as regent for a child emperor you were related to. Then, when the child grew inconveniently old, you encouraged him to retire and installed a new one. It was elegant, it was ruthless, and it established the pattern that would define the next 1,000 years. The emperor reigned, somebody else ruled. Then the warriors took over and made it permanent. In the late 12th century, the Minamoto clan won a civil war and set up a military government at Kamakura, hundreds of miles from the imperial court. The head of that government was called the shogun, and here is the crucial thing. The shogun did not declare himself emperor. He never even tried. He went to Kyoto, knelt in front of the throne, and had the emperor formally appoint him. Think about what that means. The man with every soldier in the country at his back walked into a room and asked permission from a man with no soldiers at all. Why would he do that? Because in Japan, the emperor wasn't the source of power. He was the source of legitimacy. Descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu, the sacred regalia, the ritual authority to represent the nation to the gods. The emperor held all of that, and none of it could be seized by force. You couldn't conquer it. You couldn't inherit it by winning a battle. You could only be granted it. So the throne became something stranger and far more durable than a power base. It became a machine for manufacturing legitimacy, and every strongman who wanted to rule Japan needed that machine running, which meant every strongman in Japanese history had a personal, urgent interest in keeping the emperor alive. That's the mechanism. That's the whole answer in its simplest form. The Japanese throne survived because destroying it would have destroyed the only thing that made your own rule legal. Now, I said this cost something, and I meant it. Being a legitimacy machine is not a comfortable job. Look at what actually happened to the emperors who forgot they were supposed to be symbols. In 1185, the imperial fleet was destroyed at Dan-no-ura, and the child emperor Antoku, he was 6 years old, went into the water with his grandmother rather than be captured. The 3 sacred treasures went in with him. The mirror and the jewel were recovered. The sword was not. It is still down there. The most sacred object in the imperial regalia has been at the bottom of the Kanmon Strait for 840 years, and the court has used a replacement ever since. Remember that detail. It tells you something about this institution that I'll come back to. In 1221, a retired emperor named Go-Toba decided he'd had enough of warrior government and raised an army against it. He lost inside a month. The shogunate exiled him to the Oki Islands, where he died 19 years later, and it exiled the sitting emperor too, and put a different one on the throne. Read that again. The military government deposed the emperor, exiled the emperor, and handpicked a replacement emperor, and then it kept the throne. That is the entire story in one incident. They removed the man. They never touched the office. It genuinely did not occur to them to abolish it, because abolishing it would have been like burning down the building you're standing in. Go-Daigo tried the same thing a century later, in the 1330s, and briefly succeeded. He actually restored direct imperial rule for about 3 years. Then his own leading general turned on him, drove him out of Kyoto, and installed a rival emperor from a different branch of the family. Go-Daigo fled south with the regalia and declared himself the real emperor, and Japan spent the next 56 years with 2 competing imperial courts. Even at its absolute worst, when the institution split in half and fought itself, the answer was never get rid of the emperor. The answer was always get a better emperor. Then came the poverty, and this is my favorite part of the story because it's the moment the throne should have quietly starved to death and simply refused to. The Onin War, starting in 1467, burned Kyoto to the ground and shattered central authority for a century. The imperial court lost its estates, lost its income, and had essentially nothing. Emperor Go-Kashiwabara came to the throne in 1500 and could not afford his own enthronement ceremony. He waited 21 years for it. 21 years as emperor without the ritual that formally makes you emperor because the treasury could not cover the cost. Accounts from the period describe emperors selling their own calligraphy to raise money and imperial funerals delayed for weeks while the court scraped together the funds. Now compare that to Louis XVI or Nicholas II. Those men fell from enormous height. They were so far to fall that the fall itself killed them. The Japanese emperor had already fallen. He'd been falling for 600 years. There was no height left to be pushed from. He had no army to be defeated, no treasury to be seized, no ministers to be purged. What do you take from a man who has already been reduced to a set of rituals and a genealogy? And that is the strategic principle underneath all of this, the one I want you to actually take away. The things that get destroyed in a revolution are the things worth destroying. An institution that owns nothing and commands nothing presents no target. Powerlessness, held long enough and wrapped in enough sanctity, becomes a form of armor that power can never buy, which makes what happened next genuinely dangerous. In 1868, a coalition of southern domains overthrew the shogunate, and they did it in the emperor's name. A teenage boy named Mutsuhito was moved from Kyoto to Tokyo, and Japan announced to itself and the world that after 7 centuries, the emperor was ruling again. He wasn't, really. The men who engineered the Meiji Restoration ran the country, and the emperor remained largely what he had always been, the seal of approval on other men's decisions. But the presentation had changed completely, and the presentation is what mattered. The Constitution of 1889 declared the emperor sacred and inviolable and vested sovereignty in his person. State Shinto was built up around the Imperial House. Schoolchildren bowed to his portrait. His voice was never heard in public. His image was treated as too sacred to look at directly. In one generation, an institution that had spent 600 years as a broke ceremonial relic in Kyoto was rebuilt into the divine center of a modern military empire. And here's the danger. The armor was gone. For the first time in the better part of a millennium, the throne was fused to a government's actual conduct. Whatever Japan did, it now did in the emperor's name and under his seal. That had been enormously useful for building an empire. It became a death sentence when the empire lost. August 1945, Japan is in ruins. 2 atomic bombs have fallen, the Soviets have entered the war, and the government is deadlocked. On August the 15th, something happens that had never happened in the recorded history of the institution. The emperor speaks to the people. Ordinary Japanese had never heard the voice of an emperor, not once, not in 1500 years. Radios were carried into streets and courtyards and factory floors, and a recording was broadcast. The Jewel Voice Broadcast, they called it, in a formal court language so archaic that many listeners struggled to follow it. But they understood enough. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. And now the throne was, by any reasonable reckoning, finished. The Allies had spent years debating what to do with it. There were serious voices in Washington, in London, in Canberra, in Moscow, calling for the emperor to be tried as a war criminal, or for the institution to be abolished outright as the ideological engine of Japanese militarism. Polling in the United States at the time showed a substantial share of Americans wanting him executed. The Romanovs had been shot for less. The Kaiser had been driven into exile for less. So what saved him? Here's where the photograph comes in. On September the 27th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito traveled to the American embassy in Tokyo to meet General Douglas MacArthur. The 2 men were photographed side by side. MacArthur is in a plain, open-necked uniform, no medals, hands on his hips, towering and relaxed. The Emperor stands beside him in formal morning dress, stiff, small, formal. When that photograph ran in Japanese newspapers, it landed like a physical blow. Every visual convention around the imperial image had just been broken at once, and the message it sent was unmistakable in both directions, to the Japanese that the Emperor now stood beneath an American general, and to Washington that this man could be worked with. MacArthur made a calculation, and it is one of the most consequential calculations of the 20th century. He judged that trying or removing the Emperor would make Japan ungovernable, that it would take enormous numbers of occupation troops and years of resistance to hold a country whose sacred center had just been destroyed by foreigners. Keeping the throne and using its authority to legitimize the occupation and the reforms would be faster, cheaper, and safer. So the Americans did precisely what the Fujiwara regents had done, and the Kamakura shoguns had done, and the Tokugawa had done. They kept the Emperor, and they governed through him, the oldest survival mechanism in Japanese. History worked one final time on the one occupying power in 15 centuries that had actually conquered the country. But it came at a price, and the price was severe. On the 1st of January 1946, Hirohito issued a statement now generally known as the Humanity Declaration, in which he repudiated the idea that the Emperor was a living god, and that the Japanese were a race destined to rule others. Historians still argue about how far that statement actually went, and what he personally intended by it. The language was careful, and it has been read very differently by different scholars. What isn't debatable is the effect. The divine claim that had armored the throne since antiquity was formally set down. The new constitution, in force from 1947, went further. Article 1 made the emperor the symbol of the state and of the unity of the people, deriving his position from the will of the people, with sovereignty resting with them, not with him. He was given no powers of government whatsoever. And then, in October of 1947, 11 collateral branches of the imperial family, hundreds of years of princely houses, were stripped of imperial status and became ordinary citizens. The family was cut down to the direct line and a handful of relatives. Now think about what actually happened there, because this is the elegant, brutal symmetry of the whole story. The Japanese throne was saved in 1945 by being returned to exactly what it had been for most of its existence: sacred, symbolic, and completely powerless. The Meiji experiment in divine sovereignty had lasted 77 years and had very nearly killed the institution. 1947 put it back into the configuration that had already carried it through 800 years of warlords, exiles, civil wars, and bankruptcy. They didn't save the throne by making it stronger. They saved it by making it weak again. And it worked exactly as it always had. Hirohito reigned until 1989. His son Akihito took the throne, and in 2019 did something no Japanese emperor had done in over 200 years. He abdicated, stepping down in favor of his son Naruhito, who reigns today. The transition was orderly, popular, and entirely without crisis. The oldest monarchy in the world had adapted again, which brings us to right now. Because I told you at the start that the price of survival is still being paid, and this is the part that matters most. The throne that outlived the Romanovs, the Habsburgs, the Ottomans, and the Hohenzollerns is facing a threat that no revolution ever managed to produce. It is running out of people. The imperial family today has 16 adult members. 5 of them are men. There are no children. Succession under the Imperial House Law is restricted to males of paternal descent, and after Emperor Naruhito, the line runs to his younger brother, Crown Prince Akishino, who is 60 and has reportedly indicated he would be too old to serve, and then to Akishino's son, Prince Hisahito, who is 19. After that it reaches Naruhito's uncle, Prince Hitachi, who is 90. That's the entire line. One young man. Naruhito has a daughter, Princess Aiko, who is 24 and extremely popular with the Japanese public, and polling has repeatedly shown strong support for allowing a woman to inherit. She is ineligible. A government proposal to permit female succession was drawn up in 2005 and shelved the following year when Hisahito was born, the first boy born into the family in 4 decades. And here is what most people outside Japan missed. In July of 2026, just weeks ago, the Japanese parliament enacted a historic revision to the Imperial House Law, and it wrote the male-only paternal line rule into it. The revisions allow unmarried men of paternal imperial descent, aged 15 and over, from the branches cut loose in 1947, to be adopted back into the family. They also allow princesses to keep their imperial status after marrying commoners. A former head of the Imperial Household Agency, Shingo Haketa, has described the monarchy after Hisahito as extremely unstable. Historians have pointed out something uncomfortable about the old system. It only ever worked because concubinage supplied roughly half of all emperors, a practice that ended about a century ago. The rules were written for a world that no longer exists. So the institution that survived Dan no Ura, survived the exile of its own emperors, survived a century in which it could not afford a coronation, survived the atomic bomb and the American occupation, that institution is now betting its future on the reproductive arithmetic of a single 19-year-old with an interest in dragonflies. Remember the sword at the bottom of the strait? Lost 800 years ago, never recovered, quietly replaced, and the ceremonies carried on regardless? That's the real lesson of this dynasty. It has never survived by being intact. It has survived by being flexible about what intact means. Replacing the sword, replacing the emperor, replacing the capital, replacing the constitution, replacing the claim to divinity itself, and simply continuing. Every other imperial house in the world tried to hold on to power, and power is exactly what revolutions come to take. Japan's emperors, almost by accident, discovered that authority and power are two completely different things, and that if you let go of the second, nobody comes for the first. The Romanovs had the power. They lasted 304 years. The Habsburgs had the power, 640. The Ottomans had the power, 623. The Japanese emperor, for most of his history, had almost none of it, and he is still there. But survival isn't the same as safety. The mechanism that carried this family through 15 centuries was built for a world of warlords and regents, and it has no answer at all for the problem in front of it now. For the first time, the threat to the Chrysanthemum Throne isn't an army, or a revolution, or an occupying general. It's a family tree with almost nothing left on it. If you want to see how this looks from the other side, what actually happened to the families who did lose everything, the Romanovs, the Ottomans, the Habsburgs, where their descendants are today, and what became of them, those stories are on the channel, and I'd start with the Ottomans. Thanks for watching.